Hello everyone, Sergeant Argyright here, and today, reacting to Operation Barbarossa Part 2, The Actual Invasion. Last episode, it was all about, the planning, and now, get into the fun stuff, the actual, invasion. I mean, the planning part is still really fun too. But, let's start. I don't know what the point of this intro is, but okay. That's great news. Breaking news. I don't think this is live.
News reporting from the front. All three German army groups are moving ahead at a fairly comfortable pace, and by our accounts, the Red Army should be destroyed any time now. For more information,
Yeah. Just ask Halder. By August, according to Halder, in August, apparently, the Red Army is just finished. We're done. We're great. The Red Army has capitulated.
We go live to Army Group North.
No time to lose. We must find the colony. You mean there's more of them?
This is probably just a scout. Well, I'm sure it's an isolated incident. Let's check in with Army Group South.
They're everywhere!
Well, surely it'll all be in hand soon. For more, we go to our man on the ground, Heinrich.
Whoa, we skipped a lot. What? Last episode. Whoa, they're skipping to like December. What the heck's going on?
Who is currently marching with the infantry to catch up and hopefully end the last of their resistance.
Wait, what? Heinrich, German name? What? Okay.
Apparently he's in hospital from exhaustion. Well, keep your dial here on Belt Creek News, covering the war for as long as it takes. Hopefully not much longer. This
Hopefully.
video is sponsored by ExpressVPN. Take back your internet privacy today with 3 free months.
Now.
And have some backstory to this one. I go into the planning and the reasons concerning why the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, and it'll help contextualize this video.
Yeah.
I thought it was dumb. Maybe you're right.
On June 22nd, 19...
Well, like I said in the last video, I think he described the actual planning very well, but I don't think he described the motives behind the invasion very well.
1941, the German army, along with its allies,
Oh gosh, that map in the background is awful. Oh my god. No! Hate it.
The Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. I'll be going over a few myths along with covering the main reasons the operation failed, but the first myth that I want to mention, as petty as it may be, is that Hitler did not invade the USSR in the winter. The invasion began in June.
Thank you.
As early as
Everyone's like, oh my gosh, Hitler should not have invaded the Soviet Union in the winter. No, he did not invade them in the winter. Come on, guys. It's a bit ridiculous.
Good after the spring rains, but I still see these don't attack.
Thank you.
Russia in the winter means everywhere, and it's just not true.
What are you, retarded?
You may have a point as far as continuing the invasion once the winter sets in.
Continuing the invasion? What? Are the Germans just gonna be like, okay, we went far enough. Hey, do you want peace? Yeah, sure, let's go get peace. Let's go. Okay, yeah. No. The German economy would have collapsed.
But the invasion did not take...
And then, they would have collapsed, assuming the borders would have went back to normal.
...place in the winter. Even Hitler wasn't stupid enough to do that, so... Invading forces were split into 3 army groups, North, Center, and South. Their basic objectives being Leningrad, Moscow, and Ukraine, respectively. Within these army groups, though, you basically have 2 separate armies. The Panzer troops, who are mechanized and consist of about 30 divisions altogether, and the infantry, who number about 110 divisions. The common narrative of the invasion is of the German army being this huge mechanized force, performing encirclements all around the Red Army, killing and capturing scores of men all the way until they were lightly halted in front of Moscow.
Everything's under control. Situation normal.
And to a certain extent, this is true.
Yeah, I don't know if it said this in the last video. If it did, then I apologize. But apparently the Germans, now that I think about it, I think they probably did say it in the last video. What's interesting how the German army, they lost the most amount of troops until like 1943 or no, until Stalingrad, yeah. Um, at the very beginning of the invasion.
Casualties compared to German casualties, especially once you factor in the ones lost to the encirclements, are much higher. But as Stayhill points out, you have to look at where these casualties are concentrated. The infantry during Barbarossa was only moving as fast as someone can walk, moving at literally the same pace Napoleon's army moved when they invaded Russia years prior, meaning they're going to have trouble keeping up with the mechanized forces. And this is an issue that I don't see talked about much, but is vital to understanding later problems. Because this means that the panzer divisions are the ones meeting the enemy first and taking the brunt of what the Soviet defending forces are throwing at the German army. So although German casualties look pretty light compared to the Soviets, they aren't being equally distributed amongst the army.
Can you help me out? Sorry, I got my own problems, guys.
The panzer
I never really thought of that. That's interesting. Yeah.
troops are being hit hard and are the ones taking the losses, meaning the strength of these vital troops is waning pretty fast, taking a lot of the hitting power out of the German army for these huge encirclements. This also leads to a problem of the tanks outrunning the infantry, causing dangerous gaps between the two forces that the encircled enemy may still be operating.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Like the Germans, they had these encirclements, but the Soviets, they could just walk out of them. They weren't really encirclements because the Germans, they just, came in like this, and then all their forces were up here, and then there was no one surrounding them. So the Soviets could just, walk right out.
This got so bad that between the battles of Minsk and Smolensk, Army Group Center's war diary mentions a halt period for the infantry to catch up as the distance between the two was getting too great, something that, as you can probably imagine, did not fit well with Blitzkrieg. Material was being lost at greater rates than the Germans were used to as well. The panzer groups were losing a lot of tanks not from battle, but simply from attrition. The dusty terrain of the Soviet Union proved to be a fairly poor place for the German tanks, created with Western Europe in mind, to operate. Huge amounts of dust caused by the moving tank columns driving through the dirt roads of the Soviet Union would get sucked into the engines of the vehicles, causing a high attrition rate for the panzer formation.
Really? I never really hear about that. That's interesting. It's the first time I've heard of that.
For example, in August, Panzer Groups 2 and 3 claimed losses of 50% of their tanks, most of which were perfectly capable and still usable vehicles. They just needed new engines, because the terrain and dust had locked them up.
Interesting.
Guderian on multiple occasions went to the commander of Army Group Center asking for more engines. Because the tanks were there, they just couldn't run. But this was an unforeseen issue, as the Germans always fought short campaigns in the past and planned for this one to be the same, as I mentioned in part 1. So spare engines were never created in the numbers that were needed because the campaign typically was over before these problems arose. But if the engines were available, this may not have been a fix to the problem because also, as I mentioned in part 1, the supply problems that were predicted very quickly became reality. As the Germans move into the Soviet Union, they naturally move further and further away from their supply dumps at the jumping off point, meaning that
Thank you for actually mentioning attrition, unlike every other YouTube armchair historian, whatever you want to call them.
The further they went, the longer it took for supplies to be brought up, and the things that were bringing supplies, namely trucks, were consuming more supplies themselves to get there. And this process got more and more difficult as the campaign went on. Supply groups were also being...
Especially since it got really... I forgot what I was going to say. Okay, whatever.
The large gap between the tanks and the infantry mentioned earlier, and that when going through these areas, there were oftentimes Soviet forces that would remain active, that would be able to attack the trucks, along with many of them also being lost to attrition in the same way the tanks were, from the very rough and dusty terrain of the Soviet Union. By August, Army Group Center reportedly lost about 25% of their trucks, and Army Group North had lost 39%. The other way supplies were brought up was by train. This, however, had a lot of complications to it. Firstly, Soviet trains were bigger. The Soviet Union was a larger country, so larger trains were needed to cover the distances compared to those in Western Europe, and this meant that the gauge of the rail line was greater in German trains compared to those in Western Europe. The Germans did have a couple of solutions to this, That included units moving along the rail lines that would shorten the gauges for the trains as they went along. But because German trains couldn't run for as long, it meant that they would need to create more service stations along the route to keep them running. In essence, a large-scale building project had to accompany this invasion if the trains were going to be used in the ways that they wanted to.
So you never really hear about trains. I like how this guy's pointing out all this stuff that doesn't really get talked about that much.
This was often easier said than done, though,
Oh,
as the Soviets
wow.
enacted a scorched earth policy as they retreated,
Yeah.
destroying railways, train stations, and locomotives alike to keep them falling into German hands. And although there were units instructed to move along the rail lines to prevent this from happening as much as they could, some units disobeyed these orders, and a lot of the infrastructure fell victim to retreating Soviets, to where the trucks had to remain the primary method of moving supplies throughout the campaign. And this issue really comes to a head during Operation Typhoon that we'll get to later in the series. The overall result of these supply problems ends up being exactly what the German logistics officers had predicted. A start-stop pattern over and over again for German units as they move forward. Run out of supplies, then wait for more to be brought up so they can continue again. All the way into the rainy season in the late fall.
Oh, yeah.
Even through all these
Yeah, they do pretty okay. Like, they start moving really fast until around, the rainy season and fall. And at that point, everything gets really, really, really muddy. That just makes everything more difficult. It's harder for, it's harder for what little, motorized, mechanized, and tanks they have to move. And it's harder for their supplies to get to the troops.
odds, though, the Germans were able to win a number of huge victories in the opening months of the campaign. First taking Minsk and then Smolensk, and besieging Leningrad, utterly devastating the first Soviet defensive echelon. Many hundreds of thousands of troops are taken prisoner, and for the moment to the Germans, and the world, it looks like the Soviet Union might fall, with some German newspapers in early October proclaiming victory in the East. However, German intelligence has completely failed at their analysis of the Red Army, how many troops, and how much material they could truly muster. By the Germans' count, they should have destroyed the Red Army by this point. By their rather accurate assessment of it consisting of about 5.5 million men. What they had failed to realize, though, was the Soviet Union's capacity to call up and muster the trained reservists it had. And the German commanders are...
The Soviets can get more soldiers. Really? Wow, that is very interesting.
Completely vexed by this.
Wow.
Coming to get you, Barbara.
Stop it!
After the initial invasion in June 22nd, the Red Army was able to raise an additional 5.3 million men by the end of July. And later on, although I'm getting ahead of myself, by December, the Red Army would number about 8 million men on the Eastern Front, in spite of the heavy losses.
What the heck was that?
According to author David Glantz. Although the Germans have been
Oh
fairly
no.
successful by the looks of things so far,
What did they
by
do?
October...
I think I turned on sticky keys or something. I don't know what happened. I forgot what I was gonna say again. I was gonna say something good. Let's go back.
about 8 million men on...
Oh yeah. The Germans, they had like 3 million men when they're in their initial invasion. Now the Soviets, they have like 8 million. That is crazy.
Typhoon and the approach to Moscow, the cracks are really beginning to show. They're already a month past when the campaign was supposed to be decided in September. Soviet armies continue appearing in front of them, even though by their count they should have destroyed it almost a few times over by now. Divisions are quickly becoming under strength, supplies are having more and more trouble getting to where they need to be, yet the objective is still the same: capitulate the Soviet Union. And forces are being driven ahead time and time again, without proper replacements.
It was just
and with
hopeful
exhaustion
ignorance,
growing.
basically.
The successes have been great, but there seems to be a growing dissonance between the commanders making the calls and the troops on the ground. And despite
Really?
the obvious problems that are surfacing, the grand strategy, or really
Stays
lack
the
of
same.
it, has not changed. Although
Really?
some objectives are being tweaked as time goes on. And as the rainy season sets in, Army Group Center sets itself up for what they hope to be the last push that will land them in Red Square. This video is sponsored by ExpressVPN.
Oh wow, we're done. Okay. Wow. Thank you all for watching. Unlike in the last video, I don't think they really made any mistakes. They talked about a lot of interesting stuff. Let's see. Okay. There's a number 3. Okay, looks like there's 4 parts. That should be interesting. So, if you guys enjoyed it, make sure to like and subscribe. That would be really helpful. And apologies for the lack of uploading. Um, Stuff happened, and if that ever, if I'm not going to upload from now on, I'll try to um, have videos ready to upload if I can't do it that day, and that should definitely be helpful. But yeah, very interesting video. Thank you, Potential History, for making this video. Because not very many other people talk about this, and the people that do talk about this, like Tick, for example, amazing YouTube military history YouTuber, probably my favorite actually, for World War II. You end up watching these hour long, half-hour long videos, and if you don't really have time for that, you can go ahead and watch this guy's stuff. Well, if he's not wrong about it, at least. But anyways, because he's wrong. Sometimes. But yeah, thank y'all for watching, and goodbye.